Hi, my name is Mike Duran. I'm a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and you are joining us for today's CAMCA Forum panel session. Today's session is on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the political and economic consequences of the withdrawal. We have a very distinguished panel to join us today. Before I turn to my speakers, let me just say a few words about these CAMCA sessions in case you may not be familiar with them. This is the CAMCA Regional Forum. CAMCA stands for Central Asia, Mongolia, Caucasus, and Afghanistan. This is organized by the Central Asia Caucasus Institute, the Rumsfeld Foundation, and the CAMCA Network, which is a premier convener of rising leaders from the 10 countries of the CAMCA region. And it serves as a platform for region-wide discussions and a means of advancing economic growth and social development across Central Asia and the Caucasus. It's also a means of drawing attention to Americans, I think, and others who have not been following or not been aware of the exciting developments that are taking place in this region. And I would say I am one of those people who has been awakened to the importance of the Central Asia, the Caucasus, Mongolia, and Afghanistan, thanks to the CAMCA network. I'm a Middle East specialist by training. Recently took a trip facilitated by the Rumsfeld Foundation to Central Asia, and I'm very excited to serve as the moderator today on this session. To start things off, to talk about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we have with us Dr. Omar Sharifi. He's an assistant professor at the American University of Afghanistan, the senior research fellow and Kabul director of the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies, and he is also a CAMCA network member. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Sharifi, to get us started in understanding these very momentous developments.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here in this panel and specifically talking about Afghanistan at the time that all the world in a way focused most on the withdrawal of the United States and the international forces from Afghanistan. And at the same time, what the consequences of it for the wider region and specifically for the future of Afghanistan and more importantly, the future of the whole idea of all these terrorist networks that were was the reason that why the United States actually came first to the region. So what we are facing today in Afghanistan is a major, the opinion here is that the whole idea of the peace deal with the Taliban that was done under the President Trump and then sort of reaffirmed by President Biden, somehow the whole process, the way it was sort of structured, it was done, created a lot of problems. And problems in the sense of that it showed, in a way, for the first time, it provided legitimacy for the groups who were actually cooperators of all supporters of Al-Qaeda in the beginning. And at the same time, and it in a way provided the idea was that by recognizing the Taliban, it will somehow in a way further the cause of the peace in Afghanistan. What we are facing today is the whole idea of the withdrawal is happening in a way that is not based on the realities on the ground. The decision was made in haste, and this withdrawal of the United States somehow created a vacuum in Afghanistan, which the Taliban and their supporting networks, such as Al-Qaeda, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, the other Pakistani-based groups actually taking most advantage and in a way spreading around the country. Now, what does it mean in long term? And what does it mean in a way for the security of the region and for the prosperity of the region and more importantly for the stability of Afghanistan in long term? The withdrawal of the United States somehow, as I mentioned before, created a security vacuum. Security vacuum in the sense of the United States, not in terms of military, its military participant, but in terms of providing logistical support for the Afghan forces. By withdrawing their forces from Afghanistan, all the network that sustained and helped to provide necessary support for the Afghan army, it in a way forced a lot of the Afghan troops and to withdraw from a lot of places in a way where the Taliban now taking over. At the same time, there is a lot of fear that Afghanistan will sort of go back to the 1990s and become a safe haven for the Taliban and the other kind of like extremist groups that were active before. But how much it's based on reality. Today, what we're facing in Afghanistan, despite the international withdrawal, what we're facing today in Afghanistan is not like the same like 1990s. Yes, the Taliban is as major threat as it used to be in the 1990s, but at the same time, Afghanistan as a country transformed. 20 years of international presence created an infrastructure that never existed in the course of history in the country. Not just in terms of sort of physical infrastructure, like from universities to roads to communication to media to everything else, but in terms of human capital and connectivity with the world. Today, Afghanistan, despite enormous threats by the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the other Pakistani-based groups, somehow still is an absolutely different country than it used to be in the 1996 when the Taliban emerged and took over Kabul. But the question is, will it sustain? Will it survive the onslaught of the Taliban? Will it actually manage to hold on with the withdrawal of international community from this country? Now, what in my understanding, I'm trying to contextualize, understanding Afghanistan, not just as what is happening today, but putting it in the context of what history. In the 1990s, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda managed to take over the country because Afghanistan was completely cut off from the rest of the world. That was the only time in the course of history that Afghanistan was completely cut off from the world, and that created a vacuum in which those extremist groups, specifically with the support of the Pakistani government, managed to fill and kind of took over most of the country. At the same time, what we're seeing today, the Taliban, despite their they're spreading across the country and taking a lot of districts, there is absolutely no plan for them how to govern the country. There's absolutely no plan. And that makes it actually very there is this question, will they be able to sustain this momentum? Will they be able to actually provide what the people now get used to for the 20 years? For 20 years, Afghanistan went through like a massive social change in which now we have so much to expect from, actually so much to lose. While in 1996, that was not the case. 1990, that was the case. So what will that mean for the entire region? I think the experience of the 1990s and the regional rivalry showed that no regional country alone by itself has the kind of economic kind of power nor a kind of administrative ability to somehow manage the crisis and control all these different groups that is now kind of operating under the Taliban and trying to present it's absolute necessity for Afghanistan's survival and actually for the prosperity of the region, that Afghanistan and the Afghan government remain connected with the world. Now, exactly what does it mean? Today, both Afghan government and the Taliban, thanks to some efforts by the region, are now engaged in some sort of talks. These talks are still very much subjected to the realities on the ground, but at the same time, for the first time, there is an effort going on in terms of kind of establishing a settlement between the Taliban movement and the government. How much what they called out today as a peace process is actually a realistic kind of, how much it gives us a realistic perspective about the possibility of the peace in the region. Again, any meaningful settlement in the region cannot be achieved if the world, and specifically the United States, will actually withdraw and completely kind of wash their hands from the region. That technically means that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and the other groups will fill the vacuum. It doesn't mean that the resistance against them will cease. It will continue, as just we're seeing today and these days in many parts of the country, which the people reject by local uprisings and stuff. But at the same time, it's a test. I think the whole peace process, not just simply about ensuring the peace for Afghanistan, was actually ensuring this security for the region and for the world, to kind of show that the world will not be subjected to kind of a horrific events of 9/11 again. And that can also be achieved by the direct and meaningful engagement of the world to actually ensure the transition of Taliban from a militant group into a political reality, into a political group. So we are in a very a threshold of our history, of the engagement with the international community. And there is a lot of fear that the world will simply just say, it's not going to work, we're going to leave, and leave it to the region. And we know that the region itself is in a situation in which kind of, as I kind of explained, this like kind of a strategic ambiguity. But actually what ensure this kind of a peaceful transition into peace and a meaningful transition into stability of the region, and actually that deny the space to be used again by these kind of hardliner groups, extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda or Lashkar-e-Tayyiba and all the other groups, is that the United States and the world continue to be engaged meaningfully, both diplomatically, financially, and if necessary, logistically, with the Afghan government. Because history shows that no Afghan government ever fell to an insurgency as long as it had international support. And I think an international presence, an international engagement, and a regional engagement with this whole Afghanistan actually also ensure that Afghanistan will never become another base for Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, for Al-Qaeda kind of groups and Taliban, and what will actually enable the Taliban themselves to transform into something of a political group or just a militant kind of organization. So we are now in a threshold of a very important kind of moment in our history, and a meaningful engagement with the world actually, I believe personally, will ensure stability in the region. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those very insightful opening remarks. We're going to move on now to our next speaker, but before we do, I just want to say I would like to come back to you, Dr. Sharifi, later in the discussion and talk about some of the specific ways the United States might remain engaged. What exactly does engagement mean in this new era? But before we get to that, let's turn now to Ikram Sehgal. He is the chairman of the Pathfinder Group and the chairman of the Karachi Council on Foreign Relations. His bio also tells us, I can't resist saying this, that he is the first Pakistani prisoner of war to have escaped from India. I'm dying to ask him about that, but it has nothing to do with our panel today, so that will have to wait till another time. Mr. Sehgal, we just heard this very interesting description of Afghanistan now as more connected, more linked to the world than ever before. That connectivity also includes serving as a crossroads between different countries of Central Asia and the outside world, including Pakistan. Can that connectivity and those economic interests, will they be enough to help the region and the world stabilize Afghanistan after the pullout of the United States?
Thank you. You know, I was listening very closely to what Mr. Sharifi was saying. I think it is important first to give an overview of the whole region, to understand the economic and political ramifications that are there. First of all, let us look at Pakistan. And Pakistan is a geopolitical bridge, which is not only part of South Asia, a part of Central Asia, but a part of the Middle East. Now, that with the advent of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and which incidentally is the road is through, the railway lines, of course, are not through. But if you look at the connectivity of the region, you have to go back to the Baghdad Pact and its successor, Central Treaty Organization, which formed an economic thing called the Regional Cooperation for Development. And people do not realize that during the Regional Cooperation for Development, a lot of the communication facilities in both Iran and Turkey were built up, and a little bit in Pakistan. There's a highway, in fact, stretched from Karachi right up to Istanbul, which is called the RCD Highway, which is in a very dilapidated state in between. But over the years, this highway has been improved, and the connectivity is there. Which today just needs a little upgrading. Now I'm going to back to a little personal experience, which Michael has referred to, but probably you do not know. Then when the Karakoram Highway was being made, and this was in the 60s, in the late 60s, the Karakoram Highway was a highway connecting Xinjiang province to Pakistan. At that point of time, this was the highest road in the world. And I had the pleasure and the privilege of working as a pilot, an army aviation pilot, attached to the People's Liberation Army, 2 divisions which are making the mountain highway. So for a period of 6 months, I was there and I saw the tremendous effort that was put in to cross the Karakoram Mountains. And if you really any of you can ever visit that, you can see what a stupendous task it was. During that time, I had the good fortune having an interpreter which was fresh on the job from Beijing University, the language college in Beijing University. His name was Chang Chung Zhang. And Chang Chung Zhang, and I were the thing, etc. We used to have a number of casualties because they had the old way of blowing up rocks, drilling holes, gunpowder, etc. And one day I asked him, I said, you Chinese must be very stupid. Why are you killing yourself for this road? And he looked at me for some time. He was also tired, and because there were a lot of casualties that day. And he said, no, you Pakistanis are stupid. Because you people think in terms of 5, 10 years, we think in terms of 50, 100 years. One day we'll be down to Karachi. Well, Gwadar didn't exist at that time. And Mr. Chang, that was 1970, and Mr. Chang eventually, in fact, he was the consul general in Houston also at one time, of all the things. But he went and in 2003, became the ambassador of China to Pakistan. And every year or second year, he rings me up and says, who's stupid? So the point is, what I'm trying to make is, the China-Pakistan economic corridor is only one facet of the BRI. The other facet people do not realize, and which is very important for Afghanistan, is the North-South corridor. This corridor which comes from Europe into Asia, Central Asia, and then down to Gwadar and to Shabah. Now, this is very important, and this is going to happen because the connectivity is there. Now, there is no military solution to Afghanistan, and there can never be. 20 years of it, we've seen it cannot be. The solution has to be economic. The solution has to be political. I think, first of all, let's see in the future. Mr. Sharifi has said about, people, the Afghan army regrouping. Well, really, something smaller, on a very smaller scale is going to happen. What happened to the Afghan army after the Soviets left? Most of them were defect to the Taliban, right? Except in of course, the Tajik areas and the Uzbek areas and the Hazar areas. But the Pashtun areas, most of them were defect, and this area will be the thing. I think my own feeling is that the Taliban have matured to a degree to understand that this cannot go on. This war is not a solution. So I think they will compromise to an extent. They will compromise. Now, who are the people who are interested? The people who are interested, who are the people who are interested in peace? All the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan are interested in peace. It's Pakistan, Iran, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, China, whoever is interested in peace. People who are not interested in peace do not have borders with Afghanistan. And they have got their own agendas, people fighting a proxy war, people fighting whatever. I don't want to go into that. But the point is that you've got the thing. And why economic? Can I tell you why? I was a director of Bank al-Falah. I used to see, so many millions of tons of wheat made into flour and then going across in trucks to Afghanistan. Afghanis, Pakistanis use a coarse form of flour from wheat. And the Afghanis eat a very fine type. So there were especially these milling factories, flour milling factories, which should do that. So all these were in a belt in Pakistan, this go away. Now, if that so many million tons of wheat made into flour doesn't go into Afghanistan, we would never need, and our prices of flour would be very low. Our prices of wheat, because Pakistan basically is a country which can feed and clothe itself with cotton and rice and wheat, etc. So, what is there in Afghanistan? I'll tell you what is there. If you go back to history, throughout history, Afghans used to live off the people that used to pass through Afghanistan. Right? They used to do in a crude way at that time. They used to go and, hold up the caravan and take part of the thing and said, okay, fine, go ahead, right? Well, we can do that because if you look at it, if the roads and railways are coming through Central Asia, the gas pipelines are coming through Central Asia, it has to pass through Afghanistan. If it passes through Afghanistan, there's a transit fees to it. And as Mr. Sharifi has said, the infrastructure has developed, right? So I think it is in the interest of this. We, as Pakistan, we are not comfortable. We are not comfortable with a vacuum in Afghanistan because eventually this is going to come and haunt us also someday in the future when somebody decides that, okay, now let's look at our neighbors and what we can do. Because our army has fought a very long war to eradicate terrorism within the country. This is the only place in the world where both counterinsurgency has succeeded in Fatah and Swat, and counter-terrorism has succeeded in Fatah and Swat. And even in the cities, the amount of terrorism has been cut down drastically. It's not that because I run the largest private security company in the country, and I guard a lot of foreigners. I know that there is terrorism. But the amount of attacks, normal attacks against whatever has gone down so drastically. You have, maybe 1 and 2 incidents in a year, not the amount of type of incidents that used to take place. I think if you look at it, connectivity, that connectivity is going to help Afghanistan. I think at the end of the day, Afghanistan, I think if I look at it, if I were to point out to one person, which I thought the thing was like people like Abdullah, the pragmatists, right? They are pragmatists. And I think the Pashtun elements are ready to talk to him, even though there were, a lot of discord between them because of the previous history and the Ahmad Shah Massoud group and all that. But now I think they're more pragmatic. They're talking to them. I think, but you look at it, who are people going to lose out? The people are going to lose out who really robbed Afghanistan. I'm sorry, the Afghans. You go to Dubai, the biggest owners of villas in Dubai are the Afghans. Where the money come from? The money was siphoned off all the aid that was given to them, right? And so they're the ones who benefited the most, and they're the ones who will not really lose. They've just changed countries, right? If they've not already done so. And where are the refugees going to go? We've already got 3 million refugees still existing with us, and we'll get another influx. This happens all the time. First, when the Soviets invaded, we had refugees. When when Taliban took over, we had refugees. So we are the largest, harboring the largest amount of refugees from anywhere. The Iranians never let them more than 5 miles of the border. In our case, our refugees went all over the country. In Islamabad, if you go to Islamabad, 15% of the real estate in Islamabad are Afghan-owned, right? Some of these Afghan leaders have wives in Quetta and in Islamabad. So, and it's a fact of life. So I think if you will look at it from the political and the economic point of view, I think that pragmatism is the name of the game. People have to approach the thing. People cannot just turn around and say, why this is not the same Taliban that were there 20 years ago. They're not the same Taliban. They are different. They're a different group. They're more pragmatic, right? People talk about who's leading the Afghan talks. The person who's leading the Afghan talks, actually behind the scenes is a chap called Stanak Zai. Stanak Zai was an Afghan army officer who defected to and fought with a group, a Mujahideen group, with the American support for many years. For 8 years, he fought, right? And he went, of course, when the time came, of course, he went over to the Taliban at that point of time. But he's the person who's really calling that these people are pragmatists. And they are going to see that they want this country to succeed. I think first of all, I don't see the central government, this present central government lasting, right? Mr. Ashraf Ghani is going to take a flight soon out of the country, right? That's a fact of life, right? We cannot avoid it. We don't have to stay around, right? The other people who were in the country, who stayed around the country and fought in the country will, right? They've got roots in the country. They will stay there. And I think we have to be pragmatic about it, and we have to be realistic about it. And one of the things is that we have to make sure that the Afghan themselves have a solution which they should themselves form. The Afghans do not like to be dictated by anybody, and it may be Pakistanis or anybody, right? They have to make whatever solution is, talk to themselves and make the solutions. I think if you look at it, and if you go on to this thing, I say this with some experience. I was a director of, until it broke up, East-West Institute for about 15 years, right? And John Ross, actually, I'm sure Michael knows John Ross. John Ross tasked me with this thing called Afghanistan Reconnected. So for about 8 years, I led the dialogue between Pakistanis and Afghans and Iranians, etc., Uzbeks, which we're talking about economic and mostly economic consequences. And I got a fair sense of what was happening at that time. And I got a lot of people, I understood what was happening. And I think if you go through that process for 8 years and you understand, this thing, etc., ultimately you come to one solution and one solution alone. And that is, the thing is economic. Through economy, you will have political solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that's a very interesting thesis. Certainly, there are enormous economic interests that are all aligning in the direction of stability in Afghanistan. You've got the north-south corridor from Uzbekistan to Gwadar, and you've got the east-west all the way from Pakistan to Turkey. The question is, are the interests of the spoilers going to overwhelm the interests of the pragmatists? And with that thought in mind, let's move to our next speaker, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay. He's a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. He was the ambassador of India to Afghanistan from 2010 to 2013. He's also been ambassador to Myanmar and Syria. So we're speaking with somebody who has enormous experience on the world stage in incredibly difficult places, and who knows Afghanistan like the back of his hand, I assume. So Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, I'd love to get your reactions to these this growing thesis we have here that economic interests and pragmatism are going to win the day. What's your answer to that question?
Thank you. Good day to everyone. Morning, afternoon, evening. Let me also just actually add to my bio a little there by saying that I traveled through Afghanistan as a student before the Soviet intervention. That was in 1977. So I've seen a bit of Afghanistan, and it was really part of the crossroads between the East and the West. And then subsequently, I reopened the Embassy of India in Kabul at the fall of the Taliban, that is November 2001. And I finally came back as ambassador between 2010 and 13. So I have kind of snatches or glimpses of Afghanistan, shorter or longer, over a period of time. In the earliest stage in 1977, I traveled by road. So let me first of all start off by thanking the Central Asian Caucasian Institute for inviting me to this event, and also to its partner institutions. And of course, I welcome this opportunity to dialogue with a part of the world with whom we have very strong historical ties as well as contemporary political ties. I had resolved that I'm not going to make this into an India-Pakistan issue, but I just must dismiss a couple of pot shots that were made by Mr. Sehgal about countries that want peace and countries that don't want peace not sharing a border. Of course, I should remind him that the Karakoram highway that he talked about goes through a part of what was inherited by India during partition, and also that India has contributed, pledged 3 billion in aid and has no history of interference in Afghanistan, no history of terrorism either, and the Indian embassy has been attacked not by terrorism bred from India. So, I want to begin with a very interesting observation in the eCAMCA brief for this panel discussion, which begins like this: if America continues to see Afghanistan as a standalone issue, unattached to the fate of Central and South Asia, its strategic engagement with the region as a whole may lose its geopolitical foundation. And I'd actually like to begin by saying that, in fact, the US intervention in Afghanistan has not been strategic. Self-professedly, it was there to respond to a terrorist attack. In fact, it has not really taken advantage of its presence in Afghanistan to spread its influence strategically in the region. It has been a net security provider for virtually every other country in the region, including India, but particularly Central Asia, including Russia, even Iran, and also China. In fact, it has actually really gained nothing strategically in the course of its 20-year intervention. And therefore, when it is actually leaving, the question of it preserving its strategic independence or adding to it, in fact, doesn't come. In fact, it just stands to lose. Now, starting with that, I'd like to say that notwithstanding that, the fact is that the US has been the linchpin of the security architecture of the region during this period. And its departure is going to create an enormous vacuum that will really be filled by its rivals and its enemies. Foremost among them, of course, will be the Taliban. The Taliban will certainly advance. It might not succeed. I don't think it will entirely, but it certainly will advance. The immediate gainers of this will be Pakistan, and I can see a sense of triumphalism in Pakistan that perhaps they are back to the 96-2001 days when they will have tutelage over Afghanistan. China will definitely be a beneficiary because of any space that is being vacated by the United States in the current competition between the United States and China will be occupied by China. Russia will be perhaps satisfied in the short run, but already there is a disagreement on the whole notion of the emirate with the Taliban, and very likely it might have to change its position. Iran has benefited to some extent and of course would like to see the US back out, but clearly it will also be at odds with the Taliban once sectarian and other cultural issues predominate. But let me say that while the Taliban appears to be taking over quite boldly right now, it is something to be expected. You know, the Afghan National Defense Forces have never really been trained, or they've never been prepared, even through the NATO training assignment, for a really defensive war to actually hold territory. In fact, their emphasis has been on the counteroffensive, on special forces, in being able to retake places that are strategically important to them back. So it's very likely that what we are seeing right now is a kind of repositioning, surrender territory in favor of population centers. But having said that, I would still say that we are at a moment of vulnerability in Afghanistan because of a number of factors, primary amongst them, the withdrawal of US air support and possibly a lot of technical support that might come, Taliban control of a lot of strategic points, its effort to isolate the cities and over a period of time win a kind of war of attrition. But having said that, you know, this is a new Afghanistan, as Omar Sharifi said, and this is a new Afghan army. There will be a lot of resistance. Unlike in the 1990s, the Afghan National Army will be supported by a great part of its population. The entire urban demography, the new Afghanistan that has come into being post-2001 will be behind the Republican order. In 1996, when the Taliban came, they came after a period of incredible instability and internecine conflict in Afghanistan, and they were seen as a kind of pious religious force that was going to bring in stability. That is no longer the case. Now they are seen as a terrorist force bred outside and supported by Pakistan. In the countryside, a lot of people will tolerate them, but even in the countryside, the Afghan population now strongly yearns for education, including for their girls, and there will be a very strong culture clash on that point. Now, there will not be an immediate resolution. Perhaps the stalemate may continue for a year. At the end of that year, maybe there is some reason for the Taliban to compromise. At this moment, they are looking for a military takeover, and I disagree with Mr. Sehgal that there is a fundamental change in their outlook. Their mindset remains the same. They simply have not grasped that there is a entirely new generation that has come back over the 20 years, and that there will be resistance to them. Resistance will come from various quarters. I'm running a little out of time, so let me just touch on, I think, what are the most important geopolitical aspects right now. I think what is going to happen at this is, for the time being, during this period of the last 20 years, more or less the beneficiaries, strategic and political beneficiaries of post-born Republic of Afghanistan were the new generation of Afghanistan, were countries like the United States, Europe, and India. With the US withdrawal, in fact, the strategic balance is going to shift towards China, Russia, Iran, and Pakistan. The losers will be the new Afghanistan, Europe, United States, and India. But as I said, this is not a contest that is just simply going to end like that. Mr. Sehgal spoke a lot about geoeconomics. I think if we look at it right now, what we are likely to see is that Pakistan and China will ride pity back on each other. Pakistan will be China's ears and eyes in Afghanistan. China will be Pakistan's economic horse, ostensibly to bring in some economic growth and development and prosperity to Afghanistan. But China will be wary about its investments unless it can have that stability and security as well. But more importantly, what we are seeing in the immediate phase is a kind of much larger competition between the United States and China centered on the Indo-Pacific. And what I see China in its kind of probing moves in Ladakh and Tajikistan and now through the Karakorams, trying to probe through the Pamils and the Hindu Kush and Afghanistan through diplomacy, COVID, and many other ways, in order to make a kind of strategic, breakthrough to Iran and the Gulf. In other words, China's response to pressure in the Indo-Pacific is going to be to reach across the most formidable Pamils into Central Asia, Afghanistan, and tie up with Afghanistan. This is the geopolitical contest that we have. And it's very interesting and strange that in a way that Afghanistan, which is the center of rivalry of the United States, two biggest rivals in the world right now, China and Russia, Afghanistan is right there in the weakest underbelly of China, and that the United States should be ceding such space in this area right now. It is quite possible that in due course, the United States will discover that Afghanistan and Central Asia is very much part of the US-China great game and might return to take some interest there. But in the meantime, I agree with Omar Sharifi that Afghanistan will go through a period of great instability and uncertainty, most likely conflict. And I think there are people in Afghanistan, including General Bajwa himself, who are a little concerned about the possible blowback on this on Afghanistan. So Pakistan may wish to ride this geo-economic strategy, but I'm not sure Pakistan has the capability of doing so given the condition of its own economy in its current state. It might try to ride piggyback on China, but Pakistan itself has a lot to worry about from a security point of view in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I want to break with the precedent I've set and ask you a quick follow-up question, because you have presented a very interesting and nuanced counter thesis to what we heard prior, and I want to just explore it a little bit for the purpose of the larger discussion. You have presented one of continuing conflict and also of the winners and the losers, which you presented very, very clearly. At the same time, however, you conceded a little bit, I would say, and I'd ask for your response to Mr. Sehgal's argument that there are, and to a certain extent, Dr. Sharifi's argument, that there are very significant economic interests at play here that militate in, or that at least support political stability. And so my question for you would be, is it possible that the Chinese, in their alliance with the Pakistanis and in their push to the Persian Gulf through Pakistan and Afghanistan, might be interested in throwing their weight behind stability and in an effort to at least find a pragmatic political accommodation with the Taliban?
Okay, let me respond to that. One question is that, look, this China-Pakistan collaboration can be positive if China acts as a leash on Pakistan and Afghanistan. That is one possibility. The second is that, the possibility that in fact China may use its economic weight to actually empower Pakistan in Afghanistan. In that case, of course, it will not be welcome in Afghanistan. When you look at Afghanistan, the center of gravity of trade historically has not been any other part of the world except the large market of India. In fact, the market of India of 2000 years, there has been trade and cultural intercourse between North India and Afghanistan and beyond that to Central Asia. And those are links that we treasure and we would very much like to see again. The future of Afghanistan is closely and intimately tied with trade with India. And this is the thing that has been prevented by Pakistan all this while, and that China will not be able to replace. Because there's simply, the logic of geography is not in that favor. India's history goes back 2000 years, more than that with Afghanistan. Pakistan is a new creation, maybe 75 years, getting to that point. So, there are currents of history that simply cannot be reversed. And what we are seeing right now is an aberration. Let me go back, even as late as 1977, when I traveled through Afghanistan. India used to have a military technical training team in Kabul. And this was not a political issue, even between India and Pakistan. In fact, since the Soviet intervention, Pakistan has simply tried to revise history into making people feel that India does not belong in Afghanistan, that Pakistan does. Pakistan has a natural right to Afghanistan in some ways, and India is a kind of interloper alien. That's simply not the case. You talk to any Afghan, and we are very sure how we are perceived in Afghanistan. We are perceived as a peaceful and positive force, and one that has contributed these 20 years. Omar said something very interesting, which I'd like to pick up. This 20 years was a period of relative stability in Afghanistan's history post-Zahir Shah. There has never been a 20-year period like this. This has been a period in which refugees have not left Afghanistan. In fact, expatriates have come back. That situation may change once again with the return of the Taliban, and once again the cycle will play out. Maybe the Taliban and Pakistan will come up for 5 years, but there will be a 20-year rebound after that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we will move on to Alex Vatanka. He is the director of the Iran program and a senior fellow at the Frontier Europe Initiative at the Middle East Institute here in Washington. And before we went on air, Alex also told us that he was born in Iran, but then his parents FedExed him, these are his words, to Denmark. So we have before us a representative, a product of the modern Silk Road with all its connectivity. Alex, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be on the panel with my fellow panelists. I really enjoyed the conversation so far. And I do want to be brief because I want to leave as much time for the debate. That's the part I really look forward to the most. So I'll written a few bullet points down. I'll try and do it in 5 minutes so we can get to the last speaker and hopefully the Q&A. I wanted to start up with a few basic reminders in terms of the history of Iran's policies in Afghanistan, what the drivers have been in recent years and presently, and perhaps say a few words about what to expect going forward. Look, I'm not going to surprise anyone when I say Afghanistan, from Tehran's perspective, has been a staging ground, or potential staging ground, I should say, that needed a very careful handling. That was true for the Shah, who feared the Soviets would use Afghanistan as a base to get to him in the 60s, in the 70s. That was arguably the only really calculation the Shah had for being involved in Afghanistan. And in the last 20 so years, the United States presence in Afghanistan has made the Islamic Republic, the ruling elite in Tehran, wonder what intrigue the Americans might get up to in terms of using Afghanistan as a base to get to the Islamic Republic. I think these are important to remember. Arguably what I'm trying to say here is been on a defensive side, if you will. Now, we can disagree with the articulation that Iran's policy towards Afghanistan has been a defensive one, because a lot of people would say it's been a meddling one and not necessarily a good meddling force. But certainly from Tehran's perspective, it's seen as a potential area where instability might come from, and therefore you prevent it. And that has been, you know, the driving force. Tehran, again, it goes without saying, considers itself as a natural power broker in Kabul. And you try and tell them otherwise. We heard the Indian perspective, the Pakistani perspective, and so forth. The Iranians feel they have a natural role to play in Afghanistan, and that they are legitimate. And I don't think that they're kind of almost set in stone. I don't expect any changes on that front. I wanted to read something that I wrote 2 years ago, Mike, in a paper I did for the Atlantic Council, which was titled "The Bottom Line of Iran's Interest in Afghanistan." And I wrote in that paper, somewhere on those pages, that buttressing the Western Afghan provinces on the border with Iran to create an indisputable zone of influence and absorbing Afghanistan into the Iranian sphere of economic power through the pan-regional initiatives such as the Iran-Afghanistan-India agreement, in order to use the Chabahar port as a conduit for trade among Iran, India, Afghanistan, and the landlocked Central Asian countries. So that's just one example of the type of key driving forces. I mean, this is the economic one. And I think that is still relevant to this day, but I just want to put the economic side, since we talked about that this morning. The economic calculations, to my mind, clearly come secondary, obviously, to much more security calculations that have shaped Iranian policies in Afghanistan. So I would say, right now, when I look at the Iranian debate in terms of what's going on in Afghanistan, it seems to me the one worry they have is, will there be another all-out civil war in that country, like in the 1990s? Now, what you've heard from speakers before, it seems to me, at least some are suggesting that's not going to happen because Afghanistan has moved on. And that might very well be true, but I think the Iranians aren't there yet in that assessment. So they are perhaps thinking in terms of the zero-sum game competition that did happen in the 1990s. The big question is, how would it be looking different this time around as opposed to what happened 20-some years ago? The one big change that has happened here, I think, and this is a recent phenomenon. In the 1990s, what you had was Iran, Russia, and India kind of siding in one camp against the Gulf-backed Pakistani initiative in terms of supporting the Taliban. And, you know, I hope I'm not being controversial in saying that. The question is, can that be replicated? And arguably that will not, because the region right now is in a different place. We have right now the Iranians trying to at least talk to the Gulf Arab states about the future of Yemen, potentially about the future of Iraq and Syria, which tells us that there's this sense that all the states are kind of maybe have overreached. They want to recalibrate. They want to think about their options differently going forward, which might be the good news out of this, which might be that, you know, countries like Iran are willing to sit down and compromise. I think it was today that Prime Minister Imran Khan of Pakistan, I read in the news, talked about, you know, what we did in the 1990s, thinking that one Afghan faction can win it all for us. That was a mistake, that we should encourage a dialogue among Afghan factions. If that is the Pakistani position, and if the Iranians agree, which I suspect at least a good part of the Iranian state would see it that way, then again, that to me is a hopeful sign that you're not going to repeat the zero-sum game of the 1990s, that you're going to reach for basic minimum accommodation for the sake of, you know, preventing all-out war in Afghanistan. Iran will be a major, target is not the right word, but it would certainly pay a price should there be another civil war in Afghanistan, the way it was the case in the 1990s. Look, I don't know the number. Nobody knows the numbers. 2 million plus Afghan refugees still in Iran. The country's population has grown. If you got more instability in Afghanistan, that will hit Iran, no doubt about it. And it would hit Iran at a time when Iran is very weak itself. I mean, Afghan civil war in the future could have far more direct implications for Iranian security in Iran than we've seen in the past. Where in the past it was just a refugee problem, it could be different going forward. I would just maybe sort of end up by saying the following, because as I said, I wanted to go to the Q&A. The irony is that you have right now a new Iranian president. The Iranian president, as we know, does not decide strategic decisions, but Ibrahim Raisi now and the people that are running Tehran have a choice here. Do they want to genuinely pursue deeper ties with China all the way out, the way that the 25-year strategic agreement that was signed in March suggests they would? Well, then they're in danger of becoming China's foot soldiers in Afghanistan, kind of like Iran became foot soldiers of Russia in Syria. That's not in Iranian interest. I don't think that's in Iranian interest. Love to get into that in more detail, but I just want to suggest to you that there is a group of people in Tehran for ideological reasons, because of their position in the United States, have forgotten the fact that the last 20 years, where Iran has actually done quite well in Afghanistan, stability in Afghanistan, relative stability in Afghanistan has been good news for Iran. To give you another way of looking at it, today Afghanistan, I believe, Iran is Afghanistan's largest trading partner, right? These are all good news and could not have happened without the United States having been on the ground in Afghanistan. But there's a faction in Tehran that doesn't perhaps want to see it that way and wants to gamble. And it would be a big gamble. Go in and say, you know, let's undermine the Americans. Let's get them out of here as fast as we can. Let's partner up with whoever wants to partner up with us to get them out of here, and then hope for the best. I think that would be a mistake on the part of Iran if they go there. But as I said, unfortunately, there is a group that now is rising in Tehran that looks at the region, including Afghanistan, as part of that geopolitical race that they have with the United States. And as I said, again, just to repeat it, that is a mistake on the part of those Iranians in Tehran who think that way. If they balance their foreign policy, if they accepted the fact that, you know, having a dialogue with countries like Pakistan, the Gulf states, and Russia and China is good for the future of Afghanistan, but why not add the United States to the list? And why not try and preserve as much as possible of what has been achieved for the last 20 years in Afghanistan, instead of going toward an unknown destiny when you sort of, you know, want to throw everything out and you want to start from scratch. So I'll stop there, Mike. I want to make sure we have time for the last speaker in the debate. So let me stop there.
I'm not gonna let you stop yet. You're gonna give me one more, an answer to one more question, because Ambassador Mukhopadhyay gave us a very kind of clear picture of the strategic map with Russia. China and Pakistan dominant, India, the United States losing out. I think, I could be wrong, he may have mentioned China, Pakistan, Iran in the constellation of winners. If you're sitting in Tehran, and let's just assume that Ambassador Mukhopadhyay's picture is the correct one. If you're sitting in Tehran and looking at that picture, what do you say? Where is the dominant feeling among the Iranian elite? Are they looking to reestablish the kind of cooperation with India they had back in the 1990s, or do they see themselves on the side of the Russians and the Pakistanis? Because when I'm listening to your words, and it seems like Iran is kind of a wild card here if we accept the ambassador's presentation. So very short, very quickly, what's your answer to that?
Very quickly, I would say, you know, even the hardliners who do want to go in the direction of China and closer ties with China appreciate that too many eggs in the basket of the Chinese in the long term might be untenable, that you want to balance it. I mean, in the case of India, you know, not just India, Iran and the United States. I mean, somebody mentioned the port of Chabahar, which is clearly the strategic port here. The fact that the United States, for example, gave waivers to India so they could continue investing in that port, and the Iranians were happy about it, shows you that India, Iran, and the United States all have at times this understanding. And look, if China comes in and eats everyone's lunch, that's not to the benefit of everyone. So I would say to you, and this depends on perhaps the nuclear talks going on in Vienna at the moment and so forth. So much depends on the US-Iran relationship, Mike. If you have a little bit more confidence on the part of the Iranians and they're able to have enough space to think longer term about their own national security interests, China is a reality. China is Iran's biggest trading partner. It's not going to go anywhere. But that doesn't mean you ignore India. That doesn't mean you ignore others. And I think there are folks in Tehran, in terms of the leadership that you pointed to, who get that. The question is how to admit it. And I think they just need a little bit more political confidence in terms of themselves in their survival should the United States not go after them, because remember, so much of their leadership's calculations are about their own survival at home. But I would say Russia and India have never been taken out of equation as far as Iran's long-term strategic economic plans have gone. The Chabahar port up to Bandar Anzali, up to Baku, up to Europe that way has been alive the last few years. Yeah, let me stop there, Mike.
Okay, well, that's very, very interesting. And now, last but not least, we're going to move to Iskander Akalbayev. He's the executive director of the Kazakhstan Council on International Relations and an Atlantic Council Millennium Fellow. If I'm not mistaken, he was a Rumsfeld Fellow in the past. Mr. Akalbayev, it is your responsibility to speak not just for Kazakhstan, but for all of the Central Asian countries, to explain in a very short period of time their perspective on these developments. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's a great pleasure to be part of the esteemed circles of experts and government officials, foreign diplomats. Thank you for the eCAMCA forum for this opportunity. Speaking about Central Asia, it became a part of the US interest only because of Afghanistan mainly, and certainly energy resources. But with the US presence on Afghan soil starting in the beginning of 2000, certainly the security factor and the security element in Central Asia has grown. And for countries such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan, we actually became more aware about what's happening quite near to us. And for a long time, the Afghan factor was associated with the security, instability, and the threat. Well, me personally traveling to Afghanistan, seeing in different cities and provinces what's happening there, seeing the news and different levels of society, certainly there is growing this agreement on what government is doing, and at the same time, the threat of Taliban is making everybody quite irritated and endangered. But speaking on the macro level, if you look at the US strategy towards Central Asia, the latest one, which was published last year, out of 6 main points and bullet points in this US strategy towards Central Asia, 2 or 3 points belong still to Afghanistan, as we are Central Asian states are being a connective bridge towards Afghanistan and certainly South Asia. So in this respect, US presence and US interest towards Central Asia lies on the line through Afghanistan. So it's totally understandable. So in this respect, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan with the new administration in the White House certainly raises the question why President Biden accelerates the process of withdrawal and why now? So it's a big question for a debate, and it's certainly a big signal for external, regional, and geopolitical heavyweights like Russia and China. So in this respect, Moscow and Beijing, their opinion and their influence over Central Asia is also important. There is a question actually in the chat that whether it's possible to some kind of build logistics centers from outside of Afghanistan. Certainly being part of this Eurasian landmass and having relationship with Russia and China certainly can pose different issues and questions and concerns. And we are promoting this kind of multi-vector foreign policy, balancing among big geopolitical heavyweights. So it's also a sensitive issue in this respect. Speaking about economic aspect, not only security level of US withdrawal from Afghanistan, we also need to take into account that for almost 20 years, US and other donors put more than $140 billion to Afghanistan for reconstruction as a reconstruction aid. World Bank gave $6 billion in a soft loans. There is a special fund, a reconstruction fund in Afghanistan that actually got $13 billion over the last 20 years. So it's a big sum of money that Afghanistan was able to sustain itself, its military, its security. So certainly this creates a concern inside Afghanistan, how we are able to sustain our national security service, military in this respect. But I believe that we, as a Central Asia, we also need to take into account that Afghanistan is a big economic partner, specifically for Kazakhstan. In 2019, the trade turnover between Kazakhstan and Afghanistan was $405 million. It's not a big deal, but for Kazakhstan, who's exporting its petroleum, its agricultural product, it's a big deal. So this is a very important market at the same time, but it's necessary to see the potential. So with the pandemic, which is happening now, it hurts Afghanistan, it hurts Central Asia, and the withdrawal, military withdrawal of US forces and NATO forces from Afghanistan certainly creates some kind of concern for regional powers and Central Asian states. So the C5+1 platform, which was launched in 2015 under the Obama administration, and the latest initiative under the President Trump, former President Trump, and current withdrawal certainly creates some questions among the elites and among the public at some point. So the latest visit by Special Envoy or US Special Envoy to Afghanistan, to Kazakhstan, by Mr. Khalilzad, I believe there was a sideline negotiation of how we, US is seeing the regional developments and what role Central Asia should play in this greater picture. So it's a big question for how long US is going to sustain Afghan military service or being as an advisors, or to what level US financial support is going to continue. But at the same time, we also need to take into account other voices like women voices, like youth. So it's a big market in this respect. And despite we're talking more about kind of connectivity in traditional sense, like logistics or roads, but also we need to talk about the content, what we're going to transfer and transit there. We need to take into account the digital aspect, because in Afghanistan, digital sphere is developing very fast. It's much more than in Kazakhstan or other Central Asian republics. Like Facebook, Instagram are being used widely by politicians, different factions, etc. So I think it's a great opportunity to use that digital level, digital aspect dimension by building connections between Central Asia and Afghanistan on the cultural, economic, and political levels. So mainly, this is my kind of input to the addition to the general overall discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Before I let you go, though, can I get a little bit of a reaction to this debate, this emerging debate we're having here about whether you believe the connectivity and the economic interests and the pragmatism of the new Afghanistan, possibly even the pragmatism of the new Taliban, we heard, is going to win out. Is going to win out over the forces of over the tendency of all of the actors to read this purely in a zero-sum geopolitical hard security contest.
Thank you, Michael. I think old habits die hard, and it's very difficult to say that the geopolitical zero-sum game will fade away immediately. But at the same time, we need to build up a second track where we can actually find out the common ground for political compromise. Whether this political compromise has limits, it certainly has, but I mean, to what extent? And I believe if you look at the recent and latest political dimension inside government of Afghanistan, certainly there should be more cooperation in this respect. So if you look at the parliamentary elections, disagreements between the top level officials, it doesn't help the Afghan peace process in general sense. So I believe that the main issue inside Afghanistan is it's internal, political. It has political roots rather than kind of military as a main agenda.
Is it possible that you could have the two simultaneously? So, for example, you could have a trans-Afghan railroad in the north that would benefit the Central Asian countries, also benefit Pakistan and everybody to the east. I'm sorry, everybody to the west. While you still have a lot of turmoil. Like, is there space here for ad hoc arrangements of economic and political pragmatism in the midst of a geostrategic contest, or
Ideally, yes, it's possible. Why not? I mean, if different bodies and different factions see the economic and financial interest, yes. But we are not living in the ideal world. And if you look at even the China-Pakistan transit roads and the corridor, there was some kind of even disagreements inside Pakistan through which area that corridor should pass, and different cities and different factions didn't agree on that terms. So we are speaking about different countries, and inside those countries there are different political factions. They have strong ground. So ideally, yes, we would like to see that in this way. But let's be like realist, and let's start from something smaller and bring even our cultures and perceptions together. Because in Central Asia, frankly speaking, if you ask the common public and ordinary citizens, they do not know much about themselves. I mean, about our culture. Even if you look at the Central Asian states, we do not know about the everyday life, or like singers, actors, the writers of Central Asian states. So we need to start from the grassroots of building a kind of a trust, or at least understanding that we are living we have the common destiny and the shared future in this region. We will not go away, and we will not be blocked. So it's up to government start from the bottom to the top dialogue.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let's go back to Dr. Sharifi now. After you've heard all of the presentations of your colleagues, Dr. Sharifi, has your view shifted in any way, or let's just say, where do you come down on this question of geopolitical struggle versus economic pragmatism, and how do you view the contest in the terms that Ambassador Mukhopadhyay presented?
Well, as an anthropologist, I'm always more interested in what's happening actually in the local level, and how things like interact, and how in a way small things can get together in order to somehow define the big picture. And Afghanistan to me somehow presents, and based on my experience of living here all my life, is something, a country of very unexpected things and events. But what's actually some things that certain things are very constant here. When I've heard about all this geopolitics and geoeconomics and stuff, the first question came into my mind, and especially when Mr. Segal talked about this sort of economic cooperation as a means of creating a stability in Afghanistan. I can look back at the 20 years and I say, well, we had the opportunity, quite many of it, but in fact it didn't take place. We saw the Taliban emerge as a threat. We saw that the war continued in Afghanistan. So this is sort of like a little bit, that's it actually really the case. When we talk about that, when we focus exclusively on the economic thing, kind of factors to bring stability in the region, or specifically in Afghanistan, that never happened. And actually, I have to say, in many, many instances in the last 20 years, we had absolutely great opportunities for that to take place, include from this Tapi corridors and like Casa 1000 and everything. But in fact, the war continues. So that raises the question isn't, in fact, despite being clothed in kind of economic things, is maybe it still kind of continues to be a zero-sum game. And actually some old sort of metaphors are used about like ethnic politics in Afghanistan, and then how this ethnic groups works, and therefore that everything is somehow being like become more confusing in a sense for the international community who may not be very familiar intimately with the relationship, with the sort of like this nuances of Afghan society. Well, what can kind of add to that, to kind of like add, like shed a little bit of a light, Afghanistan is literally the only, as a multi-ethnic country, as a multi-sectarian country, as a multi-religious country, it's literally the only country from China to Balkans that never had a secessionist movement. So focusing like literally the only kind, and despite the war, despite that in the 1990s especially, we didn't have a state, we didn't have an NYPD or anything else. But Afghanistan, somehow all these groups who fought with each other, Taliban, the Northern Alliance, all these groups, none of them ever actually wanted to see it, while every single one of them have their co-ethnics on the other side of the border. And at the same time, when I come about, but at the same time, I see the merits in some sort of a kind of thinking Afghanistan not just simply as a zero-sum game, but also kind of a part of a larger prosperity of the region from an economic perspective. Yes, Afghanistan has a major potential for being the connection, kind of bring prosperity to Pakistan and actually be a bridge with Central Asia, because Afghanistan now it has an infrastructure thanks to international community, especially the United States. For the first time, maybe since the war began in 20th, like since the entire 20th century, I have to say we have now an infrastructure, actually a railroad that works for that. And that kind of actually is a great opportunity to actually think and invest in that and not go just simply think about from just rivalries and zero-sum game. But if you can think about it on the other side of the coin, which is from a security perspective, Afghanistan is the only country in the region that actually have every single ethnic group that from Central Asians. We have Kazakhs, millions of Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmens, Kyrgyz, now the Pashtuns, and all these things that kind of connect with the Central and South Asia, which means that any kind of, if Afghanistan somehow be still defined through a very zero-sum game, that means that the entire security of the region will be at stake in that. And that means that we actually have a continuous war. And even despite the sense of triumphalism that actually Mr. Sehgal very openly showed, one thing we know in Afghanistan, so that the Taliban will never be able to control anything. In the height of the Afghan isolation in the 1990s, in the height that nobody cared, and the Taliban were burning and killing and destroying anything, they were not able to control all the country. They say 10%, 20%, 5%, 9%, it doesn't matter. There is no plan to control anything because there's no plan to govern. Now at the end of the day, when we think from a regional perspective, so what we have to do, it actually depends a lot on the level of engagement of the region, including Pakistan and specifically India here, and more importantly, the United States and the Central Asian states. What will be the level of the engagement? We have a choice in which that all parties that are actually think about stabilizing Afghanistan kind of remained in a more meaningful engagement to actually put an end to this war, because there won't be any victorious, there won't be anything we can't get of it. And or just they're going to continue to fight, and Afghans are very good in fighting, and they're not going to be any sort of a victory and stuff, and the chaos will continue to haunt the region, and we have probably more chaos and stuff. So it's actually in a sense that, is it the time to be like, as Mr. Sehgal pointed out and Mr. Ambassador Makopadia actually mentioned, that how we have to think about it, not in terms of totally zero-sum game, and actually think about where to create a balance. And that balance can only be achieved through a meaningful engagement, diplomatic, kind of economic, and political engagement of the world. Because none of this region, neither Pakistan nor Iran nor Central Asian states, have the means to actually unilaterally sort of ensure that stability will be possible in Afghanistan. And remember, we had an instability for about like 5, 6, 7 years, until the Taliban will kind of emerge from Pakistan. And that was at the time that actually the region and the world and somehow agreed to do that. But at the end of the day, to be very practical, and as a person who actually been very closely involved with everything that happened to my country in the last 20 years, the main question is like, are the ideological forces in the region, specifically in Pakistan, will triumph, or the more economic sort of rational thinkers that look at the region not just as zero-sum game and a space for competition with India, and actually come and just come up with a settlement through the peace process going on with Taliban, with a direct intervention of and kind of involvement of the international community to come up with an agreement. And that is the reality. Maybe the war in the region will determine, but we'll see. So
let me put, that's a great question to put to Mr. Sehgal. And let me put it to you in this form, if I may. You made a very interesting comment earlier about the deeper roots of some of these interconnectivities that we're noticing today. Mr. Sehgal, you mentioned the Baghdad Pact and the connections between Turkey and Pakistan back in the 1950s. I know recently these very interesting news stories about the Turks taking over security in the Kabul airport. I read a report yesterday which said that the Hungarians are now going to join with the Turks in this. It's very easy for me to imagine that while the Turks are filling the vacuum of that the Americans are leaving behind, and while they are a NATO power, I could see a possibility for this Turkish presence to really be welcomed by Pakistan and to be building on these older connectivities that many of us have forgotten. And that creates the possibility of some kind of accommodation along the lines of which Dr. Sharifi was speaking, hopefully for. So what's your view on this?
Well, thank you, Michael. You will permit me, because I did not get a chance for your follow-up question, but since I did not take the name of India at any time in my presentation, and I was subjected to, a lot of pot shots by Ambassador Gautam, I'll take 2 minutes just to say I can see his frustrations. The peace talks were only possible once India was kept out of it, because India was absolutely kept out of it, and that was only possible when the peace talk went, and Khalilzad, who was a friend of Pakistan previously, went ahead and did these talks. And I can see his frustration, because basically, all they're using, they had a terrific proxy war at somebody else's expense, and they had this thing, etc. But I don't want to get into the India-Pakistan slinging match, but I will answer your question in a better way. Look, Pakistan has a very good relationship with Turkey, an excellent relationship, right? And to the extent that during the time that the entire Pakistan, the ban on Pakistan, the F-16 spare parts, etc., all of them were coming to us through Turkey. Even our aircraft were being refurbished there, weapons were coming, etc. We've had our relationship with Iran has been based on our relationship with Saudi Arabia and these things, and is the Shia-Sunni thing, which we have balanced pretty well. A lot of people do not know that 28% of our population is Shia, right? And almost 28% of our armed forces is Shia, right? And this is possibly the only Islamic country in the world where there's such a balance. There is no problem at any time in the armed forces, Shia Sunni thing, etc. And that's why we like to have a good relationship. If we cannot afford to drive away countries like UAE or Saudi Arabia because of our seeming close relationship. For us, it is the easiest thing to do, because it's a contiguous thing. We have such a close relationship. Pakistan welcomes Turkey's this thing about, we have welcomed Turkey to regard, because immediately they would not have even offered it without taking some sort of thing from Pakistan, right? And they know that any support they will require will come from Pakistan, for that thing. It's not from any other country in the world. So Pakistan, is the thing. And after the first gut reaction which the Taliban gave, etc., have you seen there's a lot of muted this thing, because there's nothing like it. And I'm very glad that the Hungarians are coming in, because this gives an international touch to it also, rather than just the Turkish thing. Look, let's put it very bluntly. Like Mr. Sharifi has said, Taliban were never in control of Afghanistan during the entire time that they were. There were areas in Uzbekistan or in Uzbek areas, Tajik areas, Hazara areas, which are not in control. But the major areas they controlled were the Pashtun area, which was the majority of the population, and they will be in control there. There will be elements of them, but I think even those elements would like to come. I don't think there will be bloodletting on the scale or anything like that, because the Taliban, they would not like to go back 20 years, right? And we in Pakistan have fenced our border with Afghanistan, by the way. Our entire border of ours is fenced now, which is a very porous border, used to be, but it is actually a fence is in place, right? And, you cannot divide the families because there are tribes which have got, etc. But at the end of the day, let us put it very bluntly. Most of Afghanistan's trade comes through Pakistan. Most of it flows through Pakistan. Most of food items from Pakistan, whether it's wheat, whether it's sugar, whether it's other stuff comes. Most of our fruit comes from Afghanistan, which, by the way, we are a net exporter of fruit also, but even then some of the extra fruit, I think if you look at, then go back to China. China has done a lot of investment in mineral exploration, in mining, etc., which is Afghanistan's raw material, which Afghanistan needs, right? So there is an element where Chinese have got an economic interest in Afghanistan. Then they would like that economic interest to take. It's not, it's very well easy to take pot shots and all, but Ambassador Gautam must be very frustrated at what's really happening, and I don't blame them, because they had Afghanistan, they used to use Afghanistan as a favorite, springboard against Pakistan, and a favorite thing that's gone, right? And they should forget it, because it is the neighboring countries that, like every one of the other speakers has spoken out, it is whether it's Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, Pakistan, these are the China, which these are the countries we can take. Today we've got a gas pipeline, which is talked about TAPI, which Dr. Frederick Starr has been working on many years on TAPI. We've actually got electricity flowing in from Turkmenistan. Today, electricity is coming through transmission lines through Afghanistan to Pakistan, and Afghanistan is earning transit fees on that electricity, right? Similarly, we'll have other gas pipeline. As far as the railways are concerned, there's only a 30-kilometer stretch between the border in Chaman and Kandahar, where there's no railway line. Otherwise, the railway line goes straight from Gwadar up to Turkundi, right? Today, from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, the cargo trucks are coming through to Gwadar today, as we speak, right? So I think if you look at it from that point of view, and then Pakistan has given a very heavy price. People do not know that 50,000 civilians have died on terrorist attacks. Who was making those terrorist attacks, right? Where were they coming from? Who were they inspired by? 50,000, right? Over 200,000 injured in those terrorist attacks. We've had 6,000 soldiers killed in fighting in those border areas. 6,000, right? We've had 30,000 injured. Many of them lost their limbs in this thing. So my point is, it's all very well to just take a portion of Pakistan, keep India out of the equation, and they've got an interest. Sure, they're welcome to trade, they're welcome to do etc. Pakistan has got no problem with it. We understand. There were mistakes made, as anybody knows, and we accept it. I was the first one to say it. But the point is, this is not the same Pakistan, and that is why did United States choose to keep, and Russia, which is a very good friend of India, why did they choose to keep India out of the talks? There must have been a reason, right? So let us be very clear about it. It is the neighboring countries which have borders with Afghanistan that have got the major interest in a peaceful, stable, prosperous Afghanistan, not the other countries which are far away, which, by the way, Iran has 2 million refugees. We have more than 3 million refugees, right? Why doesn't India take a token 10,000 refugees in India? Token 10,000 refugees in India, right? So come on, $3 billion in aid. Come on, just think about how much 3 million refugees cost Pakistan on a day-to-day basis, and etc. And over 20, not 20 years, almost 30 years, we've had these refugees. So the point is, we've got to take away going on this blame, etc. We've got to concentrate on making sure that we drive the economic side towards a political settlement. And I think the political settlement is there, that the Taliban, I think, it is my opinion, given the fact of what I've understood, because I think they understand that. And they understand that there is this thing. In Pakistan, there's a realization, no peace in Afghanistan, no peace in Pakistan. No peace in Afghanistan, no peace in Pakistan. So we have a vested interest of a peaceful, stable Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Being a very sensitive observer of human beings and international politics, I think I detect a little bit of tension between India and Pakistan here. But I want to thank the two of you, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay and Mr. Sehgal, for always presenting that that tension in an intellectual fashion that has given those of us who were not participants in that rivalry very clear alternative images of possibilities for Afghanistan. And with that idea, I want to move over to Alex Vitenka. I think he had his hand up. Alex, it is clearly the job of Iran to balance between India and Pakistan. How are they going to do it?
Oh, well, I want to say something else. I'll get to that in a minute. Iran and Pakistan, India, wow, look, they tried. Remember the peace pipeline? That was the biggest effort undertaken by the three of them over 20 years ago. And whatever happened to that peace pipeline? Unfortunately, on the Indian and the Pakistani side, just didn't have the confidence. The Iranians were desperate to get that natural gas over to Pakistan and from there to India, but it just didn't happen. And I believe the Iranian section of the pipeline is ready on the border with sitting, waiting for the Pakistani side to build their part of the pipeline. Look, Iran is also, I mean, the Indian-Pakistani rivalries definitely complicate matters, no doubt about it. But the Iranian Islamic Republic, I should say, is totally guilty as well, in the sense that by the way it has carried out its foreign policy, by the way it's created a self-inflicted wound of international isolation, and the sanctions regime that's on it really makes it difficult for countries and certainly companies, international companies, to want to engage with Iran. So this is not just limited to the issue of Pakistan and Iran, Pakistan and India. The Iranian foreign policy has isolated the country. As a result, they have lost out many billions of dollars over the last, well, you want to go back to 1979, you can, or certainly recent years. So it's a part of the disease, unfortunately, that is impacting broader Iranian foreign policy. But Mike, let me just say something. I'm certainly not an Afghan specialist. I look at Afghanistan from the Iranian perspective, but I just want to make a comment. We heard today how much things have improved over the last 20 years, and certainly in my visits to Afghanistan, I have seen that with my own eyes. But so much of the improvement seems to have been on the sort of, you know, the infrastructure part and connecting the country and all the rest of it. But I do wonder why we couldn't have moved faster and more deeper among Afghan people. Because when we're talking about Afghanistan as a proxy field for foreign actors, whether regional neighboring states or extraterritorial powers, the elephant in the room is there is vacuum inside of Afghanistan, and there are local Afghan actors that are looking for foreigners to come and help them as benefactors. And unfortunately, over the last 20 years, Afghans, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me they could have made a lot more progress on that front than they have done. So Afghans are still, as a nation, unfortunately for them, so divided. But the good thing, I guess, or the reality is they're not the only ones. We've seen that in more recent years in places like Syria. You know, again, so many neighboring states went in and tapped into factions. This is not unique to Afghanistan. There is a fix to this if the Afghans and the international community want to look for a solution that is holistic. I just want to say, last point, this is something I alluded to earlier, and this is the optimist in me coming out. I sense that the Middle East, the billions of dollars that have come out from Middle Eastern states over the few last decades that have fueled conflicts from Yemen to Afghanistan to Syria to Lebanon, elsewhere. I have this hope that there's a reassessment happening on behalf of key states that have fueled some of these conflicts as part of the geopolitical zero-sum game competition. And this reassessment is something we need to once recognize what it is. Hopefully it's real. Hopefully it's going to stay. If they can find a solution to the conflict in Yemen, potentially, say, Iran and Saudi Arabia can talk about Yemen, why can't you have a conversation along those lines involving other actors, granted, but about Afghanistan? So I think there's an opportunity here with the region, seriously broader region. And I know Afghanistan is not in the core Middle East. but it's been impacted by the politics of the Middle East directly. Let's recognize that there's a trend that says dialogue is the way forward. Zero-sum game is just going to burn all of us. Build on it as much as is possible, and hope that a country like Afghanistan that needs a break will also benefit from that sometime soon. That's my what I wanted to say, Mike.
Alex, you know, when I listen to that argument of yours, I find myself looking for the key actor that could galvanize a consensus in that direction. And there are only, it seems to me, I'm presenting this as a statement, but it's really a question. There are only two possible actors, I think: the United States and China. Am I wrong? Is there another actor that could act as the catalyst or the convener that has relations with all the key actors and could arrive at a loose consensus in favor of pursuit of pragmatic economic interest over the security questions?
Mike, my response to that is, you're right, both of them could do it, but there's one big difference. The United States can do it now, whereas China would have to wait. The Chinese policy for the Middle East will take probably many years to develop. The Chinese are their biggest trading partner of all the states in the Middle East today, but they don't have a hard physical presence to be able to, defend some of the policies that they might want to go with. Actually, the United States continues to this day to be the defender of if you will, the status quo. So China could play that role, but it can't do it today. So if you want to get things done today, it's the United States, obviously with support of allied states, and hopefully the list of countries that want to go along with the United States. That list will grow for the benefit of the region. It's almost far-fetched to add Iran to it, but let's not forget Iran, the country that I was speaking to at today's panel. 20 years ago, they were briefly with the side of the United States against the Taliban, right? When things were working out. It goes back to the point I made earlier. If the Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran wants to go in a different direction in the sense of its foreign policy priorities, I think there are things that even Iran can do with the United States for the benefit of a country like Afghanistan. It's a question of priorities, and I'm not sure where Tehran is going to go. But to your point about China, yes, China is a reality of life, but I just don't see the Chinese having the confidence, having had the vision to sort of formulate that kind of a vision for the Middle East. Will they come in and they replace an entity like the United States with all the experience it's had now for the last 20 years in Afghanistan and the broader Middle East?
Okay, well, thank you. We're already an hour and a half. I think we should think now of wrapping up, but I want to give Mr. Aklbayev and Ambassador Mukhopadhyay the opportunity to respond to some of the things that have been said. Gentlemen, let's go in that order. Mr. Aklbayev, I wonder if I could also just throw one other little thing on your, it's not a little thing, it's a huge thing, but you'll have to address it because of time very quickly. I was recently in Uzbekistan, and I heard from a number of people, not officials, I'm talking about people on the street, expressed the fear that the American pullout could very well result in an increase of radical Islamic, the power of radical Islamic movements in Uzbekistan. And I wonder if that feeling is, I was not in a position to understand how widespread that feeling was, but it was something I heard many more times than just once. Is that a fear that's shared throughout the region? And what kind of measures, just in general, should we be thinking about to prevent it if it is?
Well, certainly extremism and terrorism were part of the security agenda for Central Asia for a long time. And interestingly enough, it was the only common ground before for a long time that united Central Asian states, despite some disagreements on the top level. So it's still kind of a certain issue that bothers people around the region. And if you look at the Syrian crisis, what happened in the Middle East, there was some Central Asian foreign fighters traveling to the Middle East through different countries, through different roads. And certainly that created questions in Central Asia, whether, for example, returning those foreign fighters, their families to the region, how we are going to rehabilitate them. And certainly the US withdrawal is a kind of logical continuation, whether we will have a new wave of extremism in Central Asia. But I believe that in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, specifically in these two states, we have strong measures combating terrorism. And in other cases, we're able to kind of help and assist, provide a humanitarian support to the people who suffered from different extremist ideology in this respect. But I believe it's only possible to combat this kind of threat by collective measures inside Central Asia. If we're able to create some kind of common vision and common threat index in Central Asia, how are we going to respond to that? What is our reaction to as a collective mechanism, as a collective body inside Central Asia? Are we able to do that? If we're able to promote and provide clear and transparent answers to the public, certainly this discussion will be in less degree than now.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, you get the final word.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me first say that it's been a very, very interesting discussion, and I'd like to thank all of my fellow panelists. So let me just react to a few points that have been coming up over the course of the discussion. One is, I think, your point, somehow juxtaposing geoeconomics and pragmatism as opposed to geopolitics. Let me say that geoeconomics is geopolitics through economics. If a certain country was serious about geoeconomics, I find it ironic that Pakistan sometimes talks about Afghanistan benefiting from the transit trade. All that it needs to do is open up two-way transit trade between Afghanistan and India. But we all know that this is kept one way, that the Afghanistan-Pakistan transit trade agreement has never been opened up to include trade with India. And in fact, Pakistan would be the biggest beneficiary in terms of the transit benefits that would come out of that. The second is, this business about talks. I think we have to, people need to understand this. India has the intra-Afghan talks began at Doha, and India joined that talks. It was invited and joined that talks right from the beginning. And in fact, blessed those talks. And for India, the best case scenario, the best solution possible is a power sharing agreement in which the Taliban and the Republican side compromise and are able to form a united government. There is no second view on this. That would be the best case scenario. This is our preferred solution. That unfortunately doesn't seem to be happening. And India's dealings, with, let's say, the US Taliban deal, the Moscow talks and so on. India, by the way, was part of the Moscow talks. The fact is that in those countries were cutting deals with the Taliban behind the back of the Afghan government. India was not part of any of those arrangements because India did not want to cut a deal behind the backs of the Afghan people, the Afghan Republic and the Afghan government. And India joined those talks when it was invited only when intra-Afghan talks began. And very often there's a tendency to make an equivalence between India and Pakistan on these issues. The fact is that India's record in Afghanistan and Pakistan's record are completely different. Just because Pakistan insists of linking itself with India, attaching itself to India, and equating India with itself, does not make it true. I think the Afghan people know the reality, and I think let's leave it at that. China's investments. In fact, China has not really invested in Afghanistan. It has put its property marker on some properties like Messainak, the copper mines, but it has not really invested anything. And in fact, I think China needs to be a bit wary about its association with Pakistan and Afghanistan because there is a strong anti-Pakistan feeling. And also, I'm not so sure, on the whole, it may be a good thing for China to invest in Afghanistan, just as I think it would be a very good thing for India to invest in Afghanistan. But China also should be careful that, perhaps there are some great games going on there. Just as the Soviet Union was lured into a bear trap, in the next generation, it could be China that is lured into a bear trap. I didn't have the time to go into nuances in relations with Iran, Russia, and so on. But let me just say that I think we have a great commonality of interest with Iran. This commonality of interest will come out. Iran is no pushover. It has its own independent policy, however misguided they may be. And to your question, US or China, which country can play a bridging role? I feel that if there is one country in the region that can pick up the reins, if it can lift its foreign policy game, it is Iran. Iran has good relations with just about everybody else except the United States. And if the United States is withdrawing, this is one country that could play such a bridging role. Thank you. That's all.
Well, that's a very interesting idea. You know, it is a shame when you look at the Islamic Republic to see the way it has decided to conduct its foreign policy through the Revolutionary Guards. In my recent trip to Uzbekistan, I kept hearing longing from Uzbeks that the Iranian regime would adopt a different attitude toward the world, because it is in that part of the world a kind of natural, center of gravity. It's a shame that it won't play that role. Maybe we can look forward to that in the future. If this growing connectivity of Central Asia continues, if everything doesn't roll backwards and Iran joins the family of nations, maybe we can look to something more positive. I'll end on that positive note. I want to thank all of you. This was extremely interesting. I have many, many more questions, and that I think is just a sign of how successful this has been. So without further ado, I'll say farewell, and I hope to see you again in this forum. Thank you.